Yeah, so every 10 years under the US Constitution, states have to redraw their district lines. So for Congress, as well as state legislature and even city council. And so first we do the census every 10 years, which is where we count every person in America to determine where people live. And then states have to draw up, and city councils have to draw up their legislative districts with the basic principle of having an equal number of people in every district. And what gerrymandering is essentially is drawing those lines in such a way to try to affect the outcome of elections, whether it's to protect the current politicians or protect one political party to keep that party in power, carving up the lines often in strangely shaped ways to ensure that the outcome is the way in which the people who are drawing the lines want it to be. And in most places, it's the politicians themselves who draw the lines. Yeah, I mean, gerrymandering, we're talking about political gerrymandering, is definitely a voting rights issue because it often dictates the outcome of elections and also who can control various legislative bodies. And so you have some states where the state voters statewide vote roughly 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans, and yet the legislature is controlled by one party or the other in an almost supermajority way. And that affects the outcome of lots of policies. So it directly relates to the running of the election. Well, it's hard to say every 10 years in terms of what the lines look like for people in Kentucky, but what I'll say is that when you have the presence of partisan gerrymandering, the value of your vote becomes lessened. You may live in a district that is drawn to carve out Republicans in it or carve out Republicans out of it, or Democrats, vice versa. And so you might be voting in a district that essentially is unfair because the value of your vote is different based on where you live and which district you were put in. Well, so there's not only partisan gerrymandering, but there's also racial gerrymandering. And in some states, politicians will draw the lines with race in mind to try to essentially cluster as many minorities into as few districts as possible, and so that those minorities can win a huge majority in that one district and then not have any chance to win in any of the other districts. So let's say you have a state with 10 districts. We might be able to draw the lines to put all of the racial minorities in one or two districts, and so they can control those one or two, but can't control the rest of the state. And that's a historical practice that some line drawers have engaged in, known as racial gerrymandering, to try to dilute the strength of minority voting power. And then when you get to partisan gerrymandering, it depends on who draws the lines. But if it's the Republicans drawing the lines, they might target Democrats. Again, one strategy is to cluster the Democrats into as few districts as possible. So the Democrats might win 80% of the vote in one district, so surely win that district, but can't win any of the other districts in the state. And so that way the Republicans could control the legislature overall. And the vice versa could happen if the Democrats were the ones that were drawing the lines. Well, I think one key is to adopt independent redistricting commissions. I mean, it's kind of crazy that politicians who are going to be affected and who care a lot about what their districts look like in terms of whether they can win or not are the ones that get to draw those districts. As a lot of people say, it's like politicians are choosing their voters instead of the other way around. It should be the voters that choose the politicians, not the politicians who choose their voters, their constituents. So I think the adoption of an independent redistricting commission that has an equal number of Democrats, Republicans, independents who are in charge of drawing the lines is really key. And some states have moved towards this. So Michigan voters in 2018 passed a state constitutional amendment to adopt a independent redistricting commission. And so I think that is a really good step forward. The second thing I think could be done is, although claims of partisan gerrymandering under the Constitution, saying it's unconstitutional, are now no longer available to be brought in federal court. The U.S. Supreme Court issued a decision this past June that said federal courts can't hear cases of partisan gerrymandering, but state courts are still places where you could bring a claim of partisan gerrymandering under the state constitution. And so I think that is another avenue when it happens for litigants to look at the state constitution and bringing claims in a state court.